Hello and welcome to another episode of Hack the Future. I'm Richie Etwaru and this is John Nosta. On today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive on the concept of failure. If you've watched us before, you know we go right in. John, let's start. Everyone's starting to study failure. Almost people want to fail skillfully. What are your thoughts on studying failure and learning the skill of failure?
Okay, takeaway, I love to fail. I think that failure and success, or better yet, failure and creativity share an intellectual border. And somehow people take this idea of failure and discard it. And when they discard it, they disconnect it. And things like reckless abandon, as an example. Reckless abandon is the folly of intellectual engagement where powerful solutions are found.
John, you're writing poetry here.
Well,
tell me exactly what you feel about failure. How do I become good at failing?
You have to have, I think, the psychic permission to fail. For example, we were talking about this earlier. If you tell me to draw a tree, and I've got to get it right the first time, those constraints are put upon me in a way that I am doomed to failure.
So it's the type of work that you're doing.
It's not an assembly line widget. It's fostering creativity. Now, creativity is the domain of the data scientist. Creativity is not the domain of the artist. Data filtered through a mind that's tuned to a creative frequency is where big ideas come from. That's what Oppenheimer said. That's what Einstein said.
Okay, so here's my take on failure. I love it. I've learned quite a bit from failure in my personal life and in my professional life. However, if I'm leading a group of people or if I'm managing a group of people in an organization, it feels to me that if I say it's okay to fail, it feels to me like what I'm saying is it's okay to be mediocre. And I understand that it's not the correct reaction. It doesn't reflect psychology the way it works. But being real about it, as a leader or as a manager, you can't help but think that if you encourage failure, you're somehow encouraging mediocrity. How do you square that circle?
Because I think that that's a fundamental misperception. Again, you're connecting failure with mediocrity. And I think that's an intellectual bias. If it were my company, I'd have a sign over the door. The sign would say, in this company, you'll be fired for not making mistakes. You have to change the dynamic. Now, it's also context, though, Richie.
Yeah, the context is really important. If you're making
widgets on an assembly line, then that might not be the best place to empower people to fail. And healthcare, life science, is a whole nother dynamic where, failure in clinical practice is kind of like having a patient die. So, is there intelligent failure and then sort of catastrophic failure, right? So is there a spectrum where we work with our employees and with our colleagues and say, look, it's okay to fail intelligently, but you really can't fail recklessly. And how do you define that? How do you contextualize that spectrum in the context of leadership and management? Let me answer that succinctly. No. I don't think that you can codify that kind of whimsy. You're trying to say we can codify that failure by saying you can fail within the lines. What the heck does that mean? I think you need that reckless disregard. I think it's the spontaneity where genius is found. So no, I don't think it's a good idea to kind of put blinders on and say, be creative, just use the blue crayon. I'm not so sure.
So we've set up some sort of banks here. We're on different sides of failure, apparently. I do think there is some convergence of our thinking, however. The reality is that it's really an issue of risk appetite, right? Organizations need the risk appetite to be able to go into the unknown in order to identify the new opportunities, right? I read something really interesting the other day. It said people are more willing to fail than they are to change. People are more willing to fail than they are to change. Now that struck me as strange because here failure is, BlackBerry. Okay, that's a failure. That's one type of failure. But the other failure is I was experimenting. I was in R&D. and I just didn't discover what I wanted to discover. I do think there's a dichotomy. For an individual, if they're experimenting and they're going through R&D, that's a different way to think about failure as opposed to we're making this huge, catastrophic, strategic sort of blunder.
Yeah.
Right? So there is a dichotomy, and there's different appetites of risk.
But is it a dichotomy, or is it an accident of language? That we use the word failure, and we've grown up with the word of failure. If you're in school and you fail, you just stay back, you're a bad student.
Yep.
So it's sort of blueprinted in our psyche that failure equals bad. So I think that there's a bit of a lexicon here that we're stuck in. Thoreau said, I cannot hear you because what you are is ringing so loudly in my ears. So if you peg me a failure,
Right.
there's no way I'm going to be an innovator. There's no way I'm going to be a great thinker. There's no way I'm going to be an entrepreneur because I am a failure. And I think that's a misperception, and I think it's a linguistic reality too.
So failure is important because it's the sort of raw material of success, right? It's the learning platform that you learn on. It's where you find your discoveries. People fear it for different reasons. Do people fear it because they're afraid of being fired? Do people fear it because they're afraid of shame? Going back to your childhood example, do people fear it because they're afraid of second chances? So, if you fail the first time, you'll never get a second chance. What are the things that the audience need to really sort of look internally for to say, why is it that I'm so afraid to fail?
I think that it's a fundamental human emotion. Yes, I agree. And the use of the F word in this case stimulates that in some way. But I don't think that, I think that if you have a kindred spirit, unbridled enthusiasm, it leads you into that notion of failure. They are emotional cousins. But I also think that you probably feel like you're running into a brick wall, that failure is not the appropriate endpoint. It's not a goal. It never is, when in fact it probably should be. So yeah, I know a lot of people, as a creative director in an advertising agency, all you have to do is say, the client wants it this way, and you better get it right, and I need to deliver it tomorrow. Right. And you've put the kibosh on creativity because you put such restrictions on people.
Let's talk about the hiring process. So I usually like to hire people who have failed quite a bit. Not everyone likes that. People look for perfect resumes. They look for a track record of success. Is that sort of the wrong way to go about sourcing human talent?
So if I interview an Olympic athlete, does that Olympic athlete have to win every event?
Probably not.
No, their career is actually couched in failure.
Yep.
And they win the race. They win the final race. So I think that failure in the context of hiring someone is very interesting. To me, what would be more interesting is to find out why they failed. Right. It's not the what, it's the why.
So the why, the lessons. And this is really where I get really, really sort of excited, because I feel like most of the value of failure is not in finding out that something did not work. Okay, that's great. So we check that off. That didn't work. We failed at it. It's really in the lessons that you gathered from the process. Most of the organizations that I've engaged with, we try our best to celebrate failure. And that's sort of a science of itself that you really have to sort of iron through and build competencies around.
There.
But how do you gather the lessons?
Are you celebrating failure, or are you celebrating the process?
Oh God, I've had failure parties. Yeah. I've had failure parties where
the parties a success.
Parties were a success.
Very
Yes,
interesting. So
we had failure parties, right? But celebrating failure and drawing the lessons out of it are two completely different things. Because I think the lessons are sort of the raw material of the genius that you're describing that leads to that innovative sort of thinking that leads to the new ideas.
Well, yes and no, because there's the experiential aspect.
Yep.
And then there's the analytical aspect.
Dive in on that. Share with us sort of how do we pull those out?
Well, first of all, I think that the experiential aspect is very important because what it is the proverbial light bulb. And everybody wants the aha moment. And the aha moment doesn't necessarily come through structured analytics. The aha moment comes through that I'm tired, doing something that I don't think is going to work, and all of a sudden you have that moment, that experiential moment that's not based on analysis. So I'm concerned about saying that failure in the context of creative whimsy is not really where the action is. It's in the analytics of it all.
Yeah.
And so I don't think so. I think the magic still is where the magic lives, and that's the aha. And the aha is about stumbling. But in this case, when you stumble, you don't fall. You stumble and you fly.
John, I can't tell you how far from the practicality of leadership and management that sounds. I know these are the facts, but it sounds so difficult to do given that we live in a world of success. We live in a world of results. We live in a world of measuring by results. How do we go about this?
The Wright brothers had miserable failures. Abraham Lincoln was a miserable failure.
That's great, but I can't have 800 people working for me who are all miserable failures.
Yes, you can. You just don't have them fail at the same time. And that's, I think, collective failure is different from individual pursuit of excellence.
I love that. I love that because I never really thought about the sequencing
That was good. I just made
of
that
the
up.
failure. No. It's really valuable because I am really dealing, again, I understand the value of failure. I thrive in failure. I'm dealing with, as a leader, how do I get comfortable with orchestrating followers who will fail? And part of it is the fear that it breeds mediocrity. Part of it is that, oh my God, all 800 of them are going to fail on the same day.
Well,
and
there you
it's
go.
unlikely that that happens, right? And then from the followers' perspective, from the folks that we lead, how do we make them sort of comfortable with the notion that there's no shame? There's no fear of being fired. There's no taking away of the second chances. Those are the types of things that we need to install in organizations. So we're almost halfway through. We're trying to hack the future, and the reason why we're discussing failure is because in order to figure out the paths of the future, a lot of it comes from the learning that you get through the failing process, right? So just to contextualize what we're doing here. How do we make people comfortable with failing, and how do we actually believe in the authenticity of that comfort? Because to the average employee in the average large organization, it sounds like management crap.
I think it's more about inspired leadership, and I think it's about concentrating on the result, concentrating or focusing on the dynamic of engagement, of creative play, of whimsy. Take the corporation, and switch it out with the kindergarten class. And I think it's the same thing.
I've been in corporations where it's actually a kindergarten class, but that's...
Well, that might be a good thing. That might be a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of creative play, that embracing the unexpected, and then still when it's time to have lunch, people have lunch. When it's time to go home, people go home. Interestingly, I find that children in a structured environment like kindergarten are some of the best behaved children that I know. It's when they go home that they get crazy. So I think that structured environment is really interesting. But I think, number one, it comes from inspired leadership. And that's hard, because what we have to do is have leaders who don't all of a sudden change their perspective, but grow up in this mindset. So I think that, when it talks about hacking the future, it's recognizing that this is the kind of mindset you need to nurture and reinforce as you groom people in a succession plan. I think that's part of the secret.
So let's round up. If you are trying to hack the future, you're trying to come up with the next best idea, you're trying to come up with the next best company, or you're trying to maintain that your company remains the next best company. Top 3 things for leaders in those organizations to walk away with around the area of getting the most out of failure. What are the top 3 things?
Number one is recognize that failure is not the end, and failure is not a bad outcome. It's an expected outcome. So that's number one. Number 2 is to encourage an environment of intellectual failure. And that's very different than failure. When something is broken or I spill my coffee, that's failure. But intellectual failure is a whole different context. And that is where the magic happens. That's where the interesting dynamics kind of play out. It's a thinking man's failure. That's important, number 2. Number 3 is the analytics. But don't get lost in the analytics, because that becomes a mundane rote exercise that's going to get you nowhere fast.
I would add to that. I would say one of the things that we really have to remove is the notion of shame.
Interesting.
I think that failure comes with an emotion of shame, regardless of whether people tell you that it's not there or not. And somehow or the other, across the design of your organization, your culture, you've got to be able to say, hey, there's no shame in it. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is directly aligned to your number 2. Intellectual failure is different from catastrophic failure or intelligent failure, if I may. That spectrum does exist, and we sort of have to think through that spectrum properly. And I think the last thing is around the difference between experimentation and sort of working in mediocrity. I think that experimentation delivers a type of failure that we can learn from and gather lessons from. Simply working in mediocrity creates sort of those breaks, if I may. I spilled my coffee. I mean, I spill my coffee all the time.
Before, I just want to follow up on one point.
Yep.
And that's the famous Albert Einstein thought experiment.
Yeah.
That's where he imagined what would it be like if I sat on a beam of light and traveled at that speed. It's that kind of thought experiment that gives you the psychic permission to fail, the intellectual permission to fail, even the logistical permission to fail, because you're not spilling the coffee, and that is important.
The psychic permission to fail, the intellectual permission to fail,
and the logistical
permission to fail. That is brilliant. Thank you very much, John. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
You're watching another episode of Hacking the Future. I'm Richie Etwaru. This is John Nosta. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.